Not everyone can lawfully possess a firearm in California. Firearm owners, for example, who have suffered a mental health-related event in their life, are prohibited from possessing a firearm. It's the responsibility of the state's Department of Justice to collect information from the state superior courts and mental health facilities to make sure persons with a mental illness who possess a firearm are identified and their firearms are confiscated. According to a recent report by the California State Auditor, however, the reporting system is just not working. What are the problems and what can be done to address them? We'll ask California State Auditor Elaine Howle. Armed and potentially dangerous, the state auditor's report on armed persons with a mental illness.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Our guest, California State Auditor Elaine Howle, has issued a report finding that insufficient outreach by the Department of Justice and poor reporting by the state superior courts have limited the identification of those with a mental illness who possess a firearm. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
Well, that report generated a lot of front page news. Let's start at the beginning, though. What is the state law regarding possessing a firearm? What are the rules?
The state law prohibits someone who has been deemed mentally incompetent or has a serious mental illness from owning a firearm or purchasing a firearm in the state of California. So there's a system set up for the state to be able to identify those individuals if they currently possess a firearm and hopefully to go out and confiscate that weapon.
Okay, so let's walk through the process now of actually finding someone with a mental health event and then frankly going about confiscating their firearm. What is the role of the superior courts in that process?
The superior courts have a very important role. So if an individual is in court and is deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial or is deemed to be a danger to him or herself or certainly a danger to others, the courts have a responsibility to report that information to the Department of Justice. What Justice does with that information once they receive it is they try to match that individual's name to their database of individuals who own firearms, a registered firearm owner in California, to determine whether or not that individual's weapon needs to be taken from them.
It seems like a logical process. Now we also have mental health facilities. What is their role in the process?
Very similar to the court. So if an individual is involuntarily committed to a mental health facility because of a mental illness or an event, those mental health facilities are responsible, similar to the courts, to report that information to the Department of Justice so Justice can do the same thing. Compare that individual's name to their database of firearms owners to determine whether or not that person owns a firearm and whether or not we need to take the steps to confiscate that weapon.
Is this system new? Has it been around for a while?
Well, the statute was enacted back in 2001. The database that the Department of Justice has where they match all of this information has been around since 2006. One interesting note, though, is California is the only state in the nation that has a system like this, where we do this type of matching and the courts and mental health facilities and the Department of Justice work together to try to identify these individuals.
So in other states there are people with firearms who have mental health issues and those weapons are not being confiscated?
My understanding from our Department of Justice is that our state is unique in that we have courts and mental health facilities reporting to our Department of Justice, doing that matching, and then ultimately confiscating weapons. I don't know what other states do, but certainly DOJ and the courts assert that this is unique to our state.
So what is this thing called the Armed Prohibited Persons System Database? It's a mouthful.
Right, that is a mouthful. What that is that's the database that contains the matches. So for example, we were speaking about the courts. The courts send information into the Department of Justice criminal unit, and then they have a civil unit. So that database. Then mental health facilities will be reporting to a mental health unit within DOJ. Those units then report the information, and there's a comparison to our database at DOJ that is a database of everyone in California that is registered as a registered firearm owner. When those matches occur, they're dumped into this Armed Prohibited Persons database. So you have a positive match of an individual who is a registered firearm owner and has been deemed either by the court or by a mental health facility to have had an event that should preclude them from continuing to possess the weapon.
If they're in that Armed Prohibited Persons Systems database, does that mean they automatically get their weapons confiscated?
Not necessarily. What the Department of Justice has to do is they've got to go through the process to make sure that the person who is reported by the courts that is matched up against the individual in the firearms database is the same person. So there's additional analysis that Justice has to do before they say, yes, this is an exact match, this person should surrender their weapon.
Okay, so some people change their names, of course, they get married or for whatever reason. Okay.
Exactly.
How is this different, this process different than just the typical background check that the government does when people want to purchase a firearm?
Well, the background check is similar. I mean, that's ahead of the game. So before I can own a weapon, I go into a gun shop and I want to purchase a weapon, and there's a 10-day period where there's a background check that's done by the Department of Justice, and then that determination is made, yes, this person has the ability to own a weapon, can possess a weapon. The system we're talking about today is a little bit different. I'm already a registered firearm owner. I've already purchased a weapon. I've gone through the background check. But now I've had an event in my life that questions my mental capacity, my incompetence to stand trial as an example, or I've been deemed a danger to myself or other individuals in the community. So now that weapon needs to be taken away from me.
Well, that clarifies the issue very well. Well, up next, we're going to talk about the state auditor's findings regarding the state's effectiveness in identifying armed persons who have a mental illness. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle about a recent report she had on how effective the state is on identifying the mentally ill who possess firearms. So you noted it in your report that courts have certain mental health reporting requirements. Have the courts been reporting all the individuals?
Surprisingly to us, no. The answer to that is no. What we did is we looked at the Department of Justice and determined how many of these types of events had been reported by the 58 courts in California, and we found 34 of those courts were reporting very low numbers, and that seemed surprising to us. So we surveyed those 34 courts and found that 29 of those courts didn't even know they were responsible for reporting these types of events. So that was significant from our perspective. Part of the problem is Department of Justice not reaching out to the courts to make sure that they were aware of any specific requirements, but certainly we think the court system has significant responsibility in this as well.
So 29 of the 58 courts were not reporting or underreporting?
Well, some courts were underreporting. Some we saw there were no reports at all, and that really surprised us. And when we surveyed those courts, many of them were not aware that if they had a situation in the courtroom where they deemed someone mentally incompetent to stand trial, that information needed to be reported to our Department of Justice for this particular program.
Yeah, I did notice in your report that 7 courts didn't know how many court determinations they failed to report, and 4 of those 7 were in the Valley, Fresno, Madera, Kings, and Tulare.
Right. There were a lot of in the Valley. There were several courts in the Bay Area, but again, 34 courts, 34 out of 58, so it's widespread throughout the state.
Okay, so the courts that did report, there were some that did report, did they do a good job? Did they report all of the mental health determinations?
No, we were finding similar for those courts that did report, they were not reporting all of the typical types of events determinations that are made in the courtroom, such as I said earlier, mentally incompetent to stand trial, danger to oneself or others. Those are situations where if that's a determination that's made in the courtroom by the judge, that information needs to be reported to the State Department of Justice, and we weren't seeing that happening in all cases.
So it seems like a little bit hit or miss. It's not consistent.
Right, it's inconsistent, and I think one of the recommendations we made to Justice and to the court system is to collaborate and do a better job of making sure that the courtrooms are aware of their reporting responsibilities.
How timely are the courts in getting this information to DOJ?
Well, there's some legislation that changes the rules, but when we conducted the audit, what the statute said is that information needed to be reported immediately by both mental health facilities.
Immediately is
right.
In the eye of the beholder.
Exactly, and some of the courts defined that as a couple of court days. Some courts defined that as longer than that. So we use that metric. So if a court said, well, we expect to report this information within 2 court days, so we said, okay, that's what we're going to measure you against. LA in particular, LA criminal court, and there's an LA mental health court. And we found that they were taking on average 6 to 7 court days, which again, if you think about court days, that's over a week because court days is usually Monday through Thursday. Right. So if you're talking 6 or 7, that could be up to 2 weeks before this individual is reported to the Department of Justice.
So that's a problem, obviously. What about mental health facilities? They also have reporting requirements. What did you find there?
Mental health facilities also have reporting requirements. Again, they are required to report immediately. After the first of the year, this will change with some new enacted legislation. But mental health facilities actually did a pretty good job of reporting the information. They're required to report it electronically. That went into effect in 2012.
I assume that will speed up the process.
That certainly has sped up the process and made sure that the information gets to DOJ very promptly. What we did find, however, is there were some mental health facilities that were not reporting. Part of the problem there was Justice didn't even know those facilities existed and were treating individuals with mental health issues. So we had a recommendation that Justice needs to work with our State Department of Health Services, which licenses mental health facilities, to make sure that the inventory of facilities that should be reporting is accurate, so Justice knows who should be reporting and who is or is not reporting.
So let's assume Justice gets the complete list of mental health facilities. Are they helping those facilities to determine which patients need to be identified and how to actually go about submitting a report?
They need to do a better job of that. They had done some outreach, but it's been a while. They've put out a couple of bulletins, did some training, a couple of training programs, but we think they need to do a better job of making sure that these facilities are aware of the types of individuals and the situations that should be reported to Justice.
So all of this has led to some recommendations that you have for the courts and for mental health facilities. What are your recommendations?
Well, key recommendations I think are of utmost importance is Department of Justice needs to work with our Administrative Office of the Courts, which is kind of an umbrella agency over the courts. Even though the courts have a certain amount of independence, that entity can assist DOJ in making sure that the courts are aware of their reporting requirements. The other thing that Justice is uniquely positioned to do is to do an analysis of the 58 courts like we did and said, boy, some of these courts, it looks like they're not reporting very high numbers. Reach out to those courts to make sure they understand what they're required to do. Similar on the mental health side, same thing. Do an analysis at least every 6 months of the mental health facilities and make sure that if there's a drop-off in reporting, why did that happen? And reach out to that facility to make sure, again, that they're aware of what they're required to do.
And not just present the numbers, but also take a look at the numbers. I assume that training is also part of this. You would like to see DOJ do more training as
Absolutely, well? Absolutely. Not only at the court level, but certainly at the mental health facility level, especially when you have more facilities getting licensed. They may not be familiar with the state requirements and what their responsibilities are. So we think Department of Justice should provide more training both at the court level and certainly at mental health facilities.
Okay, well, when we come back, we're going to talk about individuals who are reported. How efficient is the Department of Justice in making a determination and actually confiscating the weapons from individuals with a mental illness? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle about a recent report her office issued on identifying armed persons with a mental illness. So, all this data that's being collected or not being collected, how well is the Department of Justice doing in identifying those people that have a mental event but still have a firearm?
Well, actually, when we pulled a sample of some cases to determine whether or not the analysis that the Department of Justice staff had done, we found some errors. We actually found some instances where the analysis showed that this person, is not a prohibited person, should not have their weapon confiscated, and that was an incorrect conclusion. 3 of the 8 that we looked at were problematic. So we have concerns there. What we found is that one individual is doing that analysis and you don't have a separate individual, a supervisor or someone kind of coming behind and doing some quality control to make sure that the determination is accurate. Certainly when you make a determination that's incorrect on the side of, no, this person is not a prohibited person when in fact they should be, is problematic from a safety perspective.
What about the information that's available to the Department of Justice? Are they using all the information that's at their disposal to identify these folks?
Not necessarily. They certainly have information that's reported from the courts and the mental health facilities, but sometimes that information may be incomplete. A perfect example is they report information about an individual and they don't have their entire birth date. They may have just the year rather than the month, day, and year. And they're deciding not to use that information because it's incomplete. They still could do the analysis and perhaps do some additional research to determine whether or not that person in fact is a firearm owner and should be prohibited from using that weapon. So we think they need to exercise due diligence and doing a better job of using some of the information that they get that may not be complete. They can follow up and get the information they need.
A little more thorough. They may be arguing that they lack the staff to do that, but how are they doing in terms of processing the cases, and what's the backlog?
Well, they actually have a cap. They try to keep their daily backlog at around 1,200 cases, which seems high to folks, but they get a lot of these reports coming in both from the courts, and we think that'll go up as the courts improve and mental health facilities report a significant number of individuals that may have a mental illness that should preclude them from owning a weapon.
So if the courts and the mental health facilities do a better job, DOJ is going to be even more overwhelmed.
Exactly, and we talk about that in the report. And you're right, staffing is an issue for them. Their unit is relatively small that does these analyses. They have 10 staff. And their backlog, again, their goal was on a daily basis to have it around 1,200. We saw that they exceeded that goal in many instances, and quite frankly, we made a recommendation that the goal needs to be lower than that. It needs to be between 400 and 600 on a daily basis. We think they can be more efficient.
I think I also read in your report that one of the problems is the staff that's supposed to be doing this work gets shifted over to take care of background checks when there's a spike in the number of people after an event, Sandy Hook or whatever, who now want weapons, and so they shift their resources to doing the background checks and leaves this other situation really unattended.
That's exactly right. That's what Justice told us. As far as the background checks, there's a 10-day requirement that background check has to be completed. So the individuals, these 10 individuals in this Armed Prohibited Persons unit had been shifted to conduct background checks, so that's why the backlog continued to get bigger and bigger. It's my understanding now from the department that they'll be able to keep those individuals in what they call the APS unit, Armed Prohibited Persons unit, to focus on those analyses and not draw them away to do background checks in the future.
So maybe that daily backlog is going to go down, but they also have an historical backlog, which was, I guess, over 1 million folks. They worked that down to only 380,000. They're supposed to eliminate the backlog by 2016. Is that going to happen?
Based on our analysis, no. They assure us that they will meet that goal. When they responded to the report, and we spoke with them during the course of the audit, they're confident that they'll meet that, but in using their statistics from the last few years and when they've been reviewing these firearms owners, we think it will take them to 2019 to be able to get through those 380,000 that are remaining.
Yeah, I think the number I saw in your report was they do 43,000 a year, so chances of them hitting that target, if they're sticking with those numbers, probably isn't going to happen. What about DOJ's efforts to confiscate firearms? What were your findings there?
Well, we looked at that from the perspective of how many agents do they have, how many sweeps have they done. In the last few years, they've only done about 3 sweeps. They were able to confiscate about a little over 4,000 weapons. When we started the audit earlier this summer in July of 2013, there were 20,000 armed prohibited persons out there, over 40,000 weapons. So they've been able to confiscate a little over 4,000.
So about 10%.
Right. But there was legislation, an appropriation given to the Attorney General, $24 million, to hire more agents. She is moving forward with that. They have hired about 10, they're intending to hire 30 more agents to be able to do this type of analysis, because they have to actually analyze, make sure that that is the appropriate person, and then find that person and try to find a weapon and confiscate it.
We've only got about 30 seconds left in this segment, but I want to ask you a last question, and that is, what are your recommendations to DOJ to improve their ability to confiscate these weapons?
Well, we certainly talked about improving the analyses that they do in determining if this person truly is a prohibited person, and then moving forward with hiring agents. We think they are moving in the right direction with respect to that, and being able to put more people out on the street to try to confiscate weapons from individuals who should not have them.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to get the state auditor's thoughts on the Department of Justice and courts' response to her audit. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle about a recent report she did on the mentally ill and their possession of firearms. So how do the various state agencies respond to the audit? Let's talk about the Department of Justice first. Did they address all your concerns?
They addressed all of the recommendations, and for the most part they agreed with what we recommended. The concerns that they raised were twofold. One was a resource issue. Do we have enough staff to do the analysis? And they don't feel that they do. I mean, they certainly are able, because of some additional money that they received this year,
does that $24 million we talked about in the last segment, is that going to fill that hole?
Well, that'll fill the hole from the perspective of individuals going out to confiscate weapons. But as we spoke about a little bit earlier, their unit that does these analyses in the first place is only 10 individuals. So they still have concerns there. Hopefully they don't divert those folks in the future as they've had to do in the past. But that resources are an issue. The other issue that they raised that in their response to the report is whether or not they have statutory authority, certainly over the courts. Do we have the authority to instruct the courts as to what they should be doing as far as what should be reported to our department? Our response to that is yes. You have a responsibility, and you can work with the Administrative Office of the Courts, which is the administrative arm of the judicial branch, in working with the courts to make sure that the courts are informed of what their responsibilities are. The other thing that we said to DOJ is you're in a unique position, you have a unique perspective. You know what's being reported by all of the courts, and you can look and do an analysis of that information and work with AOC, especially for those courts that seem to be reporting low numbers, to really dig in and figure out, is it because those are truly should be low numbers, or is it that those courts don't understand what they're required to do? So
you're telling DOJ, listen, training is not telling. So you can train the courts to do a little better job, I guess, in reporting. So let's talk about the courts. The Administrative Office for the Courts, how did they respond to the audit?
Overall, they responded positively. I think they understand the seriousness of the issue, the fact that many courts weren't even aware of the responsibilities. So I think the AOC is intending to collaborate and work with the Department of Justice to make sure that the courts throughout the state are aware of what their responsibilities are and that they're fulfilling those responsibilities.
Is AOC, Administrative Office of the Courts, and DOJ, Department of Justice, alphabet soup here, are they both going to be doing training in this area?
I think it'll primarily be DOJ that provides the training. Again, they're positioned to go into the courts or to provide information to AOC, bulletins, for example, that can go out to the courts or to the mental health facilities, instructing those facilities as to what they should do and how they should go about reporting the information.
And I was reading your report. One court kind of stood out, and that was San Francisco. They seemed particularly reluctant to cooperate with the audit. For example, it said that in conservatorship proceedings, they can't, quote, dictate to the DA what petitions to bring and what relief to seek, unquote. What's your response to that?
Well, our response, actually published in the report, is that it was interesting to us for them to have that type of response when earlier in that same transmittal to my office, they indicated that they were going to reach out to district attorneys' offices and make sure that the forms had an indication where someone's deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial, that information is in fact reported to justice. So it was surprising to us for the court to take that perspective.
I also noted in your report not a single firearm prohibition in any of the more than 2,100 conservatorship orders that they had in San Francisco. So that's interesting, 0 out of 2,100. Anyway, so where do we go from here? What's the follow-up of this audit?
Well, the follow-up process for any of our audits, and this one has garnered a lot of attention from the members of the legislature. There are 3 members that requested the audit, but we've briefed many members of the legislature. There may be some oversight hearings, but certainly my office has a process where we hear from the agency 60 days, 6 months, and 1 year after we issue the report. So we should be getting status reports not only from the courts, from the AOC, DOJ as well. So we'll be publishing that information on our website as to what progress those entities are making in implementing the recommendations.
So the state auditor is watching.
That's right.
And we do a follow-up. Well, I want to thank State Auditor Elaine Howle for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can sign up for our award-winning and free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.